What's going on, guys? Today we're talking all things split squats. And now, note I'm talking about the split squat and not the lunge. A split squat is a static unilateral leg variation where the legs are going to be planted and we're going to perform a single leg squat motion. A lunge is going to involve a step and it's going to be more dynamic, so we'll either be stepping forward, backwards, laterally, and so forth. So that's the main difference between the split squat and lunge, and now obviously there are some nuances there when it comes to adaptations and when and how to use each. Now we're going to break this into a bunch of different sections, so we're going to talk about the how-to, some common mistakes to avoid, variations to try, and also talk about the benefits. Okay, so when performing the split squat, a lot of questions often come down to stance. So you want to take a stance that isn't so in line to where the feet are literally right in front of one another. You can stagger them out a little bit, go with what's most comfortable for you. And then when it comes to how wide you're standing, try to get into a 90-90 drill with the knees. So the front leg is going to be at 90 degrees, the back leg will be at 90, and then start from there and adjust accordingly. Oftentimes I'll start there and then I'll bring my back foot in a little bit. Now, when we start to do the eccentric or the lowering portion in the split squat, we're gonna allow that knee to track. We're gonna think about keeping that pelvis in almost like a cylinder and going up and down, like as if a string is pulling it. Like I'm a puppeteer pulling my pelvis up and down. So we're gonna lower down slowly, allowing that knee to track. We're gonna think about gripping the floor on that front foot, and we're gonna have a slight forward lean with the torso because that's gonna allow us to put more weight on that front leg, and that's what we are trying to facilitate. We don't wanna have our chest back where we're not gonna be able to load up that front leg accordingly. Now, once we hit depth, again, we're gonna think about having that pelvis track directly upwards and maintaining some torso integrity. So whatever torso position you started in, try to finish in a similar position. You don't wanna have too much wavering going on because again, that will take weight off that front leg and you'll stand up to the fullest extent in which you can, depending on the variation you're doing, and you will repeat this process. Now, when it comes to breathing, a lot of times folks will breathe similarly to how they would in a bilateral squat, but remember that breathing and bracing, especially when doing different variations and accessories, it's gonna be fluid. So breathe accordingly to how you're loading and the weight you're using. If you're using a little bit more weight, then you might need to firm up your brace a little bit more and be more conscious of how you're breathing. But just note that your breathing and bracing should be fluid and you should scale whatever type of brace you're using based on the implement and the weight you're using to maintain your torso and mechanic integrity. All right, so 4 common mistakes I'll often see with the split squat is number 1, taking way too wide of a stance. So people will take this long split stance, and then what ends up happening is they don't end up loading the front leg at all. It pretty much defeats the whole purpose of the variation for what I'm probably pretty sure what they're using it for, which is, again, to target that front leg and load it accordingly. The second mistake I will see is leaning too far back with the torso. So again, we want to have a slight forward torso lean so we can keep weight on that front leg, and obviously that will depend on how we're loading. If we have an interior load, we might be a little bit more upright, but again, it's going to come down to how we're loading. But at the end of the day, we do want to have a slight bias towards putting more weight and emphasis on that front leg. We don't want to be leaning back, taking away from the movement's emphasis and effectiveness. The third mistake I will see, and I mentioned this in the how-to, is having the feet perfectly aligned. So this is not only really hard to do, but it's also not the most effective when it comes to trying to target the quad and the glute and the musculature that's needed to create a stable pelvis in the split squat. So if you are taking a little bit of too much of a narrow stance, try to widen it out a little bit. Now obviously you don't want to take like almost like a B stance with, but a slight bias that's going to be not so much in line is perfectly fine. The fourth mistake I will see with the split squat is, once again, not keeping the pelvis tracking up and down. So they'll be pushing off the front leg back. And Dr. Pat Davidson talks about this a lot in his split squat videos and variations, but we don't want to basically push away with our leg and our front leg for that matter. We want to think about driving up. So we want to think about keeping that pelvis in line and actually loading that front leg. When we push off and push ourselves back, we tend to take away a little bit of the emphasis of the weight we're trying to put on the front leg. But those are only 4 mistakes, and those are 4 pretty common ones I often see with the split squat. All right, so one of the major reasons I love a split squat personally is because once you conquer the basic mechanics of it, there are infinite variations you could do based on the adaptations you want. And the way I like to structure my thinking with the split squat is to look at it from like a more micro and then macro scale. So when it comes to micro and macro changes to the movement for that matter. So a micro change would be altering tempo, altering loading. So you can do a bilateral load, you can do a front load, a goblet load, you can do a zercher, you can do an ipsilateral, contralateral. You can do so many different forms of loading that will drive different demands on the variation you're doing. So if you're just doing a traditional split squat and you just learned this movement, play with different forms of loading before you necessarily jump to other more, let's call them advanced variations. Now, once you've altered loading, tempo, and variables that are more of an easy change, so you could even experiment with active foot split squats, you can then change the overall stance position and what you're trying to do with a split squat. So you can do the rear foot elevated split squat, you could do a front foot elevated split squat, you can do a 1 1/4 split squat. These are all popular variations that you can experiment with and try. Now, why you would do them, it's gonna come down to what your program scope looks like and what your goals are, because they will each have a slightly different adaptation. Now, I'm gonna film a different and larger video talking about different split squat variations and the whys behind them, but I did wanna touch on that in this video because I do think we often think of split squat variations as being black and white and only having to do with elevating the back foot, elevating the front foot, and so forth. But in reality, there are infinite ways to change this movement if we look at it from a micro and macro scale, so altering loading, tempo, and so forth. But those are some of the most common variations that you can experiment with and try. And again, each of those will be used for different reasons. All right, so some benefits that come along with split squats is number one, how dynamic they can be. So once you conquer and understand single leg squat mechanics and you start experimenting with split squats, there are infinite ways you can progress this exercise. And that makes it super friendly for beginners, intermediates, and advanced athletes who are all going for different adaptations. So by altering loading forms, by altering stance positions and so forth, we can really make this movement as dynamic as we need it based on our skill level and what we're trying to go after. The second benefit I love split squats for is obviously that it's great for building single leg strength and stability. So if you're working on your single leg squat mechanics, again, split squat is phenomenal for doing so. We can add tempo, slow it down, and really focus and build our awareness of where our pelvis is through space and time, how we're biasing our movement, how we're putting weight into our front leg, and the list goes on from there. The third benefit of split squats is that they're pretty easy to perform no matter where you're at. And honestly, you can make them as difficult as you need based on the equipment you have. So again, circling back to point one, if you're at a hotel gym, if you're stuck right now in quarantine working out at home, more than likely there is a split squat variation that you can use for some form of muscular growth or strength on a unilateral standpoint, and you can implement that with strategy accordingly based on your availability. So third benefit of split squats is that it doesn't take a lot to perform them. You don't need a ton of equipment, you don't need a ton of resources. All you need is some basic how-to and elbow grease and you got yourself some great split squats. The fourth benefit of split squats is that you can add in different elements to make this movement even more athletic in nature. So if you want to add in rotation and so forth, you can do so with a split squat fairly easily because again, there are so many different ways to load it and so many different variations. So you can add in a rotation if you want to work on your thoracic rotation abilities and work on some of your oblique strength and so forth. So those are just 4 of my favorite benefits with the split squat. Now note that the list goes on for split squat benefits, and really your benefits are going to scale and ebb and flow based on the adaptations and goals you have at hand. All right, that wraps up my split squat video. If you made it to here, you are a real one, and I appreciate you for giving me your time and hopefully taking something away from this video. I do want to make a longer split squat variation video where we talk about the whys of the context behind different loading patterns, different stance positions, and so forth. But I don't want to bog you down with too long of a video right now. So if you have any questions, drop them down below. And as always, guys, like the video, subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next one.